First of all, this is the name of the webinar, is Creating Components with React and Redux. And we're going to be going over these topics. So there's a lot to go over, and we have an hour, so we're going to try to fit in whatever we can. And as I go through the topics, we'll also bring in a sample application, take a look at that, and see how that works along with those the topics that we bring up. So the first thing is Redux principles. Just how does Redux work? What does it do for us? And then there's a couple of things related to Redux: actions, reducers, data flow, okay, that we'll take a look at. Then we'll talk about a package that you can use to integrate Redux with React. Okay, so you don't just use Redux and React by including those two libraries. You need to also include the React Redux library. So we'll take a look at what that adds into the mix. Okay, and once you've added that in, there's some topics you need to cover, which is how to wrap the application or wrap your components with Redux, which is by using the provider. We'll take a look at that. And then by mapping state and dispatch. Okay, dispatch is the way that you're going to get actions to run. Okay, and finally, the last thing you do in each of your components is you run connect, and that wraps the component inside of Redux and makes sure that all the state is available to the component. Okay, so let's take a look at our presentation here. This presentation and the agenda that I just showed you are both available in the handouts section. They also should have been sent along with any email that you got. If you didn't see the email or for some reason it's not on the email, then take a look in the handouts section and you can download this information from there. This is the chapter out of the two files. The other one was the agenda. Okay. So the first thing I should mention about Redux is that it is possible to create React applications without Redux, right? So there's a reason why you're going to use Redux, because when your application gets larger, there's going to be a lot more things that you do in the application that need to change the state of the application. The state has to do with the data that's displayed, okay, or the data that's also being collected. Okay. So with small applications, you may get away without using Redux, but as you get to larger applications, it gets harder and harder to manage that change in state, and therefore you want a system that's set up to do that, and that's what Redux adds to React. Okay. So what Redux does is it manages an immutable data store. Okay, data store is where your state is going to be. Okay. Now, if you're new to all this, when I talk about state, I'm really talking about an object that you keep in your application that has all of the other data in your application inside of it. Okay, so if you have an application that has a list in it, then you're going to have a state object which is in the store, and inside that state object, one of the properties of it is going to be the list, and then inside of that list property will be the actual list data. Okay. So Redux manages this immutable data store. We'll talk about what immutable means when we get to it a little bit later in the presentation. Okay. The other thing that Redux uses is actions. So you create actions, and each action is going to be used to change the store or to change the state data in a specific way. Okay. So the actions are used like as commands. Okay. The actions are read by something called reducers. Reducers are these kind of action or command processors. You send an action to it, and it will take a look at the action that you have sent along with any data that you've sent, and then change the state accordingly. So for example, if you have an action that says add record, and then you have a record, you pass the record also. You pass both of those things to the reducer. It will go through what's needed to change the state of the application so that that record has been added. Okay. Now, when you update the store, okay, which you do by sending an action to a reducer, that updates the state, and it triggers a re-render of the components. Okay. So every component on the screen Redux is going to take a look and see whether you've changed data that's required by that component. And if you have, it will go and modify that section of the screen. Okay? So if you added a list item, it will modify the list on the screen. If you've changed the first name field, but you haven't changed any of the other fields, then it will go and re-render the first name field, okay, and leave the other ones alone. Okay. So in order for it to do these types of processes against the store, you need to create actions. Actions are just going to be like commands. Okay? They describe the intent of the user. And you can also include in the action added properties that carry the data that you want to use when you're changing the state. Okay? So in this case, they're payloads of information that send data to the reducer, and the reducer then adds that data to your state object. Okay. These actions themselves are formatted as just regular JavaScript objects. So you see an example of that down here. Here's a very basic action, right? So it's just a JavaScript object with a type, and in this case it has some text. Okay, so type is the minimum amount of properties that the action can have. After that, you also have whatever data you need. And in this case, for an add book, you need the text or the book title. Okay, so you may, include one piece of data or multiple pieces of data, okay, in the action. Okay, but then what you do is you take the action, you send it to the reducer. The reducer then processes, figures out which action you sent, and then that's where you're going to put your logic that modifies the state. Okay. So when you create your actions, you're going to create them with a type, and you want that type to be human readable, something that when you read the application, it will make sense to you, but it's also going to be used programmatically to figure out which of the actions you've created. Okay. So here's an example. Just sometimes you'll see types implemented as constants. Okay. This is just to make them more reproducible within the application so that you're not always using the string, because if you're always using just, in this case, add book as a string, then you might wind up naming it something incorrectly or typing it wrong at some point. So here you're using a constant to create the action. Okay. Now another thing that you'll see with Redux is action creators. Okay, so you have the option to actually create the action object wherever you use it and make the type equal to a string or equal to that constant that you created. Okay. But what you find in most cases is that you're going to have a JavaScript file where you have all your action creators in the same place. And an action creator is just simply a function that's used to emit an action object. Okay, so you pass in the data. In this case, delete book, you need to pass in the ID. ID is added to the object, and then the object's returned. So that's the way you're going to get your action that you're going to then send to the reducer. Okay. Now, the way that actions are sent to the reducer is by dispatching them. Okay. And we'll see later on where we get this dispatch method from. Okay, so this dispatch method is not just any method that you call dispatch. It's actually a specific method that's part of Redux that's going to send that action to your registered reducers. Okay. So this first one takes the delete book action. So you're creating it with the delete book action creator. This is the object that represents the action. You're passing it to dispatch, which will then send it on to your reducers, which will do something with it. Okay. There are also, so that's one way to do it. Another way to do this is to use something called a bound action creator. So you sometimes see this code in this fashion. Okay. So you'll have bound delete book equals, and then an arrow function here, okay, which includes the dispatch method. Okay. So it's just taking what you saw up here one step further. by having it run the dispatch also. So when you want to actually call this, you'll get this bound delete book, and you'll call it with the ID like this. And this last piece here will not only create the action, but it will also pass the action to the dispatcher, which sends it to the reducer. Okay. So the reason why we show the different ways is that depending on how you choose, you can use any of these ways to dispatch your actions. Okay. So what happens? We're talking about dispatching, and we're talking about sending things to reducers. So what does that really mean? Okay. Let's see. We'll get back to this. This will be more relevant later. So why don't we take a look at the next slide, which is the reducers. Okay. So the reducers you're going to create. There's going to be typically more than one. Okay, because each reducer is going to work on a different part of the state object. So you might have a state object that has a list, and you might have one reducer, which is a class that just processes that part of the state object. Okay, you might have another reducer that processes a different part of the state object, maybe not a list, but a record, a single record, or something like that. Okay, so what reducers do is pretty straightforward. They take the previous state, and they take an action, and they produce a new state. Okay, so that is their whole job. Okay, you want to make sure that they don't do anything other than that. So there shouldn't be byproducts of what these reducers do. The reducers should be fully contained and only do what's mentioned here, which is take a previous state, the action with its data, and produce the new state. Okay, for those of you who might be interested, you know, where does this term reducer come from? Well, it comes from the prototype method reduce, which is just part of JavaScript array objects. You can use reduce to change the state of an array. Okay, so they just happen to use that terminology. Okay, so reducers change the state by you passing an action. Okay, but reducers should not do these things here. Okay, so if you pass an action with data in it, the reducer should not modify that data. Okay, it should also not modify the original state. What it does is it replaces the state. Okay, with a new object. It shouldn't mutate. Okay, and what mutate means here is to take an object and to change the data inside the object. So if you have an object that has a, a person object that has a name property, and you do person.name equals something new, you're mutating that object. Okay? But if you say person equals, and then you have a whole new person object on the right-hand side of your equation, then you're actually replacing the whole object with a new object in memory. Okay? And that's not mutating. Okay? Reducers should also not have byproducts of what they do. So they shouldn't be calling APIs, or implementing routing, or doing anything else but changing the state. Okay, if anything else needs to be done in the application, there should be other ways to do it. Okay, the reducer's job is only to change the state. Okay, and reducers, if they do need to call other functions to do the work that they do, they should call pure functions. So they should not call non-pure functions. Okay, so what's a pure function? Okay, when you have a pure function, it's defined by the fact that when you send the same parameters to that function more than once, so if you call the function once with parameters A and B, and then you call it with A and B again, you should get the same results each time. Okay? Now, that kind of, when you first hear that, you're like, well, yeah, of course it's going to give you the same results each time, But think about it, there are certain types of functions that don't do that. Okay, and two of them are listed at the bottom here. Date.now. If you call that once, and in this case there's no parameters, if you call that once, it's going to give you the date now. If you call it a couple seconds later, it's going to give you a different date, whatever the time is when you called it. Okay, so that's not a pure function. Okay, the same thing with math.random. Okay. Math.random, even if you give it parameters, if the same parameters are sent more than once, it's not designed to give you the same value. It's supposed to give you a random value. Okay? So these are some examples of things that are not pure functions, these last two items here. Okay? So your reducer should qualify itself as a pure function every time you call it with the same parameters, meaning the same action and the same data that goes with the action. It should give the same results. Okay? And it should not, and one of the things it shouldn't do is then call non-pure functions, okay? Or call any functions that do something other than changing the state. Okay, so here's an example of a reducer, right? So you have this reducer, it's called person app. It takes the state, it takes an action, and typically you'll see reducers using switch cases or if then else if blocks of code. Okay, the whole idea here is that you're going to pass in this data, it's going to switch on the action.type. If the action type is change name, it's going to run this piece of code here. Okay. And in this case, it's going to assign a new value to the state object. That's what object.assign is going to do. We take a little bit of a deeper look in object.assign later. Okay. The one thing you don't want to do here is just go and in this case take the name and modify it on the existing state object. Okay. In this case, what's happening is you're constructing with object.assign a whole new state object based on the data that's in the original state object and that came in the action.name. Okay. By combining those, you can create a new object in memory, which can then be reassigned to state. Okay. Here, we've just got another case in this reducer called default name. So if you wanted to set the default name on this particular state object, you could do that. Okay. But in most cases, you'll have more than one or two of these case statements within your reducer. Okay. So now let's back up a second and say, well, why are we doing this? Okay. Well, you might have an application where you add a record. You want to add like a person or a customer or something like that. Okay. And you have a form on the screen and you click on submit. Okay. So what you're going to want to do is take that data that's in the form, add it to an action, and typically the action would be called add record, add it to that action, and then submit or dispatch that to the reducer. The reducer will see that you're going into add record. It'll take the data and it should use that object.assign to create a new state based on that. Okay. So in this case, we're not yet talking about a situation where you have a back-end database. We're just talking about changing the state within like an array that backs up the screen. Okay. Another thing the reducer should do is if there was no state to begin with, if the state was null, just say the first time you go in, then the reducer should return an initial default. So it should set a default state. Okay? So in this case, the whole state object is just a state object that has a name property in it. And you set the default state here, and it's checking here if the initial state when the reducer is first called is undefined. So it hasn't been defined yet. It will then set the default state and then move on to the rest of what needs to be done in the reducer. Okay. So what we've seen there is the essence of what is being done with Redux. We're just changing our state using this system of actions and reducer. Okay. But now how do we actually stitch that into our application? That's what we need to know. And the way we do that, or to set up any React application with Redux, the first thing you need to do is install Redux. So you do that like this with Node Package Manager. You can install the React bindings to Redux using this, npm install React Redux, React-Redux. So that's a second package. And that second package is what we're talking about now, which is how to stitch the Redux into the application. Okay. So you start off with this. You need to set the store, or you need to create the store to begin with. Okay. So you initialize the store with let store equals create store. Okay? This store object has a couple of functions, one of which is dispatch, right? So most of the time you don't need to call these directly. Okay? But let's take a look. I'm going to bring up an application at this point, and then take a look at its code. So that as we start talking about how you stitch these things in, we can actually take a look at some application that we have and see some live code. So let me go and open up the editor. Okay, now here, so the editor's coming open. Here's the application that we'll look at. Okay, we'll just take a look first to see what it's doing. Okay, it starts off with some data. Now this particular application is backed up by a Mongo database. So that provides its initial data, and then the data, as it's changed, is updated in the Mongo database. So we have those things running locally, the Mongo database, and we have a lightweight node-based RESTful web service that's being used, okay, along with this. So when we click on different items here, okay, even when we click on an item, it's changing the state of the application. So in between those clicks, an action called set default, I think. I'll have to look at the code. It's basically setting the selected item. Okay. If we want to add a new book, we can do this. Click New Book here. It assigns a new ISBN, and let's say War and Peace. Okay, it's the book, and we give it a price, $23, and we hit Save. Okay, so now when we click Save, it's going to add the book. Okay, and it adds the book to the book list. So this is what you would expect from this type of application. You're able to take existing data and edit it and save it. Okay, it saves back up to there, or select other items. It's a basic, data-driven application. But in order to do what you see here, there's a lot of different actions that are involved. Okay, but let's take a look first at the code that goes with the slide that we're talking about, which is create store. Okay, so here's the application in code, and we'll find it under source. Okay, the way that you enter these applications is you start with the index.js file. Okay, and in the index.js file is where you see the create store. Okay, so you said store equals create store, and you're passing in this reducer, or in this case, it's actually this book app is the file inside the reducers directory that combines all the different reducers. Okay, so in this case, there's I think 3 or 4 reducers that are involved there in the reducers directory. They're being added to the store because that's the way you modify the store. And without the reducers, Redux wouldn't know how to modify the store. Okay, so here we go into the reducers directory, and we see, for example, books.js, which is going to be a reducer that sets initial values if you need them, and then in this case has add book. So it'll process an add book action, it'll process a delete book action, okay, and it'll process an apply books update, things like that. Okay, when I said that we can change the selection, when I click on something, that would be app state. Okay, so here's an app state reducer that all it does is change this, the selected ISBN and the selected book, by passing selected book and an action object. You're adding a book to the action when you create it. Okay. So the point here was really just to go into that first file, which is index.js, and see that at the root of the application, you're creating your store before you actually create your first or render your first component. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit more at this point about immutability. Okay, state objects are supposed to be immutable. okay? But in JavaScript, objects generally are not immutable. Okay, you can modify them as much as you want. You can add properties to them. You can modify the properties. So the nature of JavaScript lets you mutate objects. Okay, so you have to override your thinking when you go to change state objects. Okay, because to use Redux, the whole idea here, and even with React, is to create state objects that are immutable. Okay, so they become immutable by the way you treat them. Okay, if you don't treat them as immutable, you'll wind up mutating the object, and you'll get artifacts or things that you don't expect to happen in your application, and you don't want that. So you don't want to modify objects directly. When data changes, you want a new object to be created with the new data plus the old data, but it should be a new object. Okay, and then you want to assign that object back to the existing state variable. Okay, so those are the things that are happening inside of Redux. Okay, using the actions, passing the actions, and the code that you write in the reducer. Okay, so what are the benefits of being immutable? Since it's not something you get for free, right? Being immutable, you have to write code that treats the objects in an immutable fashion. Okay, but what you get out of it is that Redux can easily see what state has changed from a previous state to a current state. Okay, and it can, so that's the where of it. The framework can find out where in your state object something has changed and only make changes to whatever that affects. The other thing it does is it can tell when the state has changed, because if you're treating something as immutable, the only time state can be changed is when you reassign a new object to the state variable. Okay, so it's easy. Whenever the state variable gets reassigned, you know the state has changed. Okay, so as a side effect of these things, okay, changes can be applied in order, the way in which they were originally sent. Okay, you just basically replay them with the same actions by applying the same actions, or they can be rolled back by unapplying those actions. Okay. Now, so when I said that this is not something that comes for free, it means that you need to create code in your reducer that treats the objects as immutable. Okay. Now, one thing that helps is that there are certain JavaScript types that are immutable. Okay, the number type, the string type, the Boolean type. Okay, whenever you modify one of those, you're actually reassigning a value to the variable. Okay, even though it might look like you're changing the existing one, you're actually creating a new object in memory, not object, but piece of data in memory. Okay, so those are naturally immutable. So if you're changing that kind of data, you have less to worry about. But if you're changing objects, which is what you're changing in most cases, or arrays, those things are by nature mutable, which means that you can change them by just modifying pieces within them, okay, which is what you need to try to avoid. So for objects and arrays, you need to do something special in order to move your state forward from a previous state to a new state. Okay. So one of those things involves this object.assign. Okay. So to create a new object in memory, you can use object.assign, and you can pass in a target object. Okay, and usually when you're doing this for the purposes of Redux, you're going to be passing in an empty object. So you're going to start with a target object that's empty, so that you don't wind up mutating an existing object. Okay, so you create a new object, and then you can pass in various data sources. Okay, and these would be other objects that get added, okay, to the target object to produce this new object in memory. Okay, so here's an example. Object.assign, you're going to start with a target object, which is an empty object. You're going to add the old state data. Okay, so this is going to be done by the code inside of assign. It's going to just go through everything in the old state, add it to this new object, and then add whatever else you have. So this is going to be added now. Okay, and if there was a name property in the old state, this will then substitute for that here in this new object. Okay, so the output of this object.assign is going to be the object that you will set the state with, or in this case, that Redux will set the state with. One of the other things that you have to change, in addition to being able to copy objects, you need to be able to copy arrays. Okay. So you have an array, for example, of to-do items. And here you just have the item is buy milk. So these are really simple objects, but you can imagine that they might have other properties also. Okay. So when you add an item, you might be tempted to just push a new item onto the array. Okay. So now you're going to add item call mom, and that's going to be another item on the array. But that is mutating the existing array. Okay. It doesn't reassign a new array from memory to the array variable. Okay, so that is mutating. Okay. So what you want to do instead is what you see down here. Okay, you're going to start again with this to-dos. This is your original state, and then down here you're going to say, here's my new item or my new object that I want to add to that array. Okay. And then you use you're basically creating a new array. That's what the square brackets do here. You're using the spread operator here in order to copy everything from the existing array, which is this existing one up here, to copy all the items from that into the new array. Okay? And then, just to be sure, you're going to create a new object, okay, in memory, okay, that's based on this new item. Now, you could probably shortcut this a little bit by just, instead of what I have selected here, you could just add this. Okay, that would probably be fine. Okay, but you should also remember that a lot of times the new item that you're passing in is not being created from scratch like it is here, and a lot of times it's being passed from your application somewhere. And if it's being passed from your application, okay, then if you just put that object in this location, okay, that's not the same thing as creating a new object. So, so just keep that in mind. Either create the object from scratch like this, or ensure that it's going to be a new copy of the object by using object.assign to create that new copy. Okay. So now you have the old objects in the array and the new item in the array. Okay. Now it's also something that you'll need to do as your application gets more complex, you'll need more reducers. Okay? Each reducer is going to handle a specific subset of the state variable. Okay? So if I have a state variable that has a list, that list is going to be handled by one reducer. So for example, in this application, okay, in this application, I have the app state reducer, the books reducer, the form state reducer, and they're all going to be added together here in this call here called combine reducers. So combine reducers is part of Redux, and what it'll do is it'll just add these different ones, the form state, the app state, and the books, these different reducers, and it'll add them all together so that it creates this one kind of super reducer that when it gets data, it's going to apply them to all those other ones separately. Okay. So what do we have in these different things? Well, in the application itself, we have a form at the bottom. We want to be able to manage the form. Okay, so we'll need a reducer for that. Okay. We also have application state. Application state here just has to do with whether I've selected an item or not. Okay, and that changes the state. It doesn't change the other data, but it does change the selected value. And then you have the list, and the list needs to be maintained on its own also. Okay, so those are three aspects of the state that you want to change, and they correspond to these different reducers. Books for the list, app state for the selected item, and form state for the state of the data that's in the form. Okay, so if we take a look, we've looked at, I think, books. Okay, we have add book, and we have delete book. Okay, and then in app state, we have select book. So when you click on an item, it selects it, and let's see how that's done. Okay, so this is the part of the state that needs to be modified, the part of the state that represents the selected ISBN and the selected book. Okay, So the first thing we're going to do is, when this gets called, it's going to get called with an action called select book. Okay, and that action is going to have a book, okay, that you've passed into it. So let's step back a second and go to the actions, because we're going to need to create an action that gets sent to the reducer. So we go to the actions, and here select book. Okay, in order to create that, you pass in a book object, and it gets added, okay, as the second property in the action. Okay, so now you have the actual book that you want to add, or that you want to select in this case, is the second item. Okay, so that's what we have going into the app state reducer. Okay, so we get this action that's passed in. Okay, the action has a type and it has a book. Okay, what we do is we take the book and we add it to another blank object to create a new object called book copy. Okay, then from there we're going to change our state. We're going to say that the state is going to look like what you see up here: selected ISBN and selected book. Okay, so we want to create a whole new object that represents those two values. Okay, so we start off by selected ISBN, action book ISBN, and then selected book and the copy of the book. Okay, because we don't want to pass the exact book that's in the form, we want to pass a copy. So that's the copy we create up here. Okay, and by adding those two together and using object assign, that creates a new object that looks like this object up here, but it's a new object in memory, represent the newly selected book. Okay, and all you have to do is that much. Then you just return that new state value. Okay, the Redux application takes care of reassigning the state and rerunning all of the rendering of the application. Okay, so you have multiple reducers that handle different parts of the state. Okay, and what you should know is the React always calls all of the reducers. Okay, it just like loops through them and calls each one with the action. So there may be multiple reducers that handle the same action. That's okay. Okay, you might have them do different things. Okay, so this is where you combine the reducers. I showed that in the reducers directory, because that's where we're putting all the reducer files. We also add an index.js file that does what you see here, which is combine the reducers and create this root reducer. This reducer is the one that gets added to that create store object. Okay, the create store object was in the very first file, okay, that you get into in the application. Does create store book app. And where does book app come from? It comes from the reducers directory. Okay, and if you don't put anything after this, okay, it's just saying get me the default file from the reducers directory, which is the index. Okay, and that index is where we're combining the reducers. So that's what book app turns out to be. Okay, so this is the index file here from the reducers directory to combine all the reducers in that directory. Okay, so we have this React Redux. Okay, we've already seen some certain parts of it, like the create store, right? And dispatch is going to be part of this. So how do we use this application to add these reducers and things to our application? Okay. Okay, and I'm just now seeing a question that came up about source code. And so that would the source code be shared? If you could just add a little bit more about that, I can answer that. I'm not sure of if you're talking about this application here, or you're talking about something else. Okay, because we can certainly just give you a zip file with this. I'm not sure who would do that. I guess whoever sent out the original emails. Okay. Okay, React's Redux. There's a couple of things that you need to do. First thing you need to do is attach the app to the data store. And you see that happening with provider in that first index file. The next thing you need to do is connect your various components. Okay, and we'll just go through the different parts of this. The first part is this provider. Okay, normally the root of your application. Okay, so the root of the application here is going to be this app component that you've created. Okay, provider is not a component that you created. It's actually something that's part of Redux. You see that up here, part of React Redux. It's part of the glue code. Okay. Okay, and yeah, so the app that I'm showing, I'll provide that back to the coordinator and see if they can send that out to everybody. I would put it in the handout section, but the handout section of the webinar doesn't allow for zip files. Okay, it just handles PDFs and doc files, things like that. So I'll send it back to the coordinator to see if they can email that out to people, the source code. So here we have the provider. So we're wrapping our main application. This is going to be the root component of our app. We're wrapping it in provider, and we're passing it to store. Okay, we created the store by using the create store here, which is also from Redux. Okay, so you're starting to see these things go together, right? The reducers get passed to create store. Store is then used to set on the provider. And because it's set on the provider, store is going to be available, which means the state is going to be available to all of the components that are in the application. Okay. Okay. The next thing we need to do is mapping. Okay. We need to, and this is done in each component. Okay. So you need to map state to props. Okay. So what you're going to do is, if you have a state, the state variable, okay, you're going to take parts of that and map it to specific properties that are going to be used within your component. So if you have a books, like a list of books, that's part of the state object, you're going to map it to just books. And then books is what you're going to use within this current component where this mapping is done. Okay? So what this does is it simplifies the path to the actual data in the state. Because a lot of times, as your application gets more complex, you'll have state.books.this.that, and it'll be a long string. So you really don't want to have to use that long string within your template code, for example. Okay, the other thing that you're going to map is dispatch. Remember, dispatch is the way that you're going to get actions to run. Okay. So a lot of times when you have the user do something on the screen, when they click on an item, when they click on a button, okay, that's going to directly cause an action to be sent to a reducer, okay, or that's the effect that you want, right? They click on new book, and there should be a new book action, okay, and the way that that new book action gets sent to the reducer is by dispatch. Okay. So what you're doing here is you're creating a bunch of methods, okay, that wrap around dispatch in order to handle events that happen in the user interface. So that's what map dispatch to props is doing. Okay. We're creating a property here called handle click, which is actually a method, okay, that when it's used within your template, okay, you add it to a button or something like that. It will go down here and dispatch the update item action. So that's what the action is here. Okay, but it's kind of an odd name here, map dispatch to props, but it's really allowing you to use dispatch because that's being passed in for you in order to execute actions. Okay. Okay. So let's see. So you map these different properties and methods in these different methods that you add to your class. Okay, but then you need to use them somewhere. So I've created, let's take a look at these. Map state to props. I've created a books property and an app state property. I have another property called handle click. Okay, so we want to use those inside of our template. So here we're creating our template, constant book list. So book list is going to be the name of our JSX template. And we're passing in those three things that we created: books property, app state property, and handle click property, which happens to be a method. Okay, and then somewhere in our template we can now reference them. Okay, but the only reason that they're available here is because we did these mapping stages. Okay, so now we have this data and these methods to work with. Okay, and there's one other thing that you need to do just to get that part to work. You need to run connect. Okay, and I'll actually show a component where this is done, so maybe it will glue things together for you. Okay, so you've created map state to props inside of one of your components. You've done map dispatch to props, and now you're going to pass them to this connect method. Okay, the connect method is going to return a method that you're going to run with your component name. Okay, so in this case, my app refers to the component that you've created in the same file. Right, you're going to pass that here, and it's also exporting it. Okay, so that when it's used elsewhere as the default, that's how you're going to bring it into other templates. Okay, because you're exporting it from here as a component. Okay, so this is called wrapping the component. Okay, and let's see. This is the last file here, and then we'll go to some code. Configure store. You see what it does is it does the create store. This is just another way of creating the store. Okay, so instead of just creating the store right inside that index.js file like I showed you, you would actually create another file that includes all the reducers and includes Redux, things like that, and creates this configure store function. Okay, then later on you'll use the configure store function. Okay, instead of the create store function. Okay, so it just really has to do with where you want to put your code. In some cases, people want to keep things as separate as possible, so they create this small piece of code as its own file. Okay, so the reason why we mention it is that if you're reading through somebody else's code, you may find that it looks like this, and you just have to map and remember that it's just doing the same thing as we were doing before, which is creating the store. Okay, so let's take a look at these last couple of slides we went through, creating a component. Okay, by doing this thing, mapping state to props, mapping dispatch to props, and then passing it to your component into your JSX component, then wrapping your component using connect. So those are the things we'll take a look at in code. Okay, so let me close all of these first, and we'll go back to here. So what we're going to be talking about now is the components. So let's take a look. We have this book list component. Okay, and the book list component, let's take a look at the different parts of it. Okay, it's got some variables that are used. Okay, we won't worry about those now. But the main part here is this book list. Okay, and a book list is going to take these different properties. All of these properties are going to be mapped later on in the file. Okay, so that they become available. So once they've been mapped and they've been passed in here, then you can use them in your template. So here's the template. Okay, a template has a div, it has book list here as an H4, it has an unordered list, and then it maps all of the books to their own book item. Okay, and there's another component, which is a thin component, that's just a book component that will take this and make it show up on the screen. Okay, so that's what's creating this book list here on the top. Okay, you also notice this button down here represents this new book button. Okay, so that's what you would normally do in React to create a component. Okay, so what are we doing differently here? Okay, now that we're using Redux. Okay, what we're doing, let's see, we're mapping state to props. Okay, so we're taking the state variable, which is the main state for the whole application. We're saying in that state, we want to set books as a property on the current template to be equal to state.books. Okay, so state.books is on the actual state object, and you're just kind of aliasing it so that you can use it as the word books. Okay, then here, this, I'm not sure how this came about, but this should really just be app state right here. Right, so you're taking state.appstate and you're aliasing it as just app state. Okay? The other thing that you're doing here is matching dispatch to props, which is a little bit more involved. You have to do something on a init. Okay, so you're going to want to pass this on a init function in so that the first time the list is displayed, it runs this and it goes and retrieves data, okay, for the first iteration. Okay? But then whenever you're using the form, there's a couple things that can happen. Okay, you can click on that new book button. Okay, so think about the form. You can click on an item in the form. That's one thing that you can do. Or you can click on new book. Okay, those are the only two things that you can do with the book list itself. Okay, this other one, book form, is a whole different component. Okay, so here, this handles the new book click when you click on the button. Okay, and so what does it do? It does a console log, so that's just logging out. But then it's going to dispatch update form usage. It's going to, this is an action method that creates an action called add. Okay, update, or it's the update form, sorry, update form action, and it's going to dispatch the update form action. Okay, and it's going to change the state of the form to add. Okay, so when you click the add button, the type or this property or this flag is changed. Okay, and then it's going to unselect. We're using -1 to say unselect any book that was previously selected. Okay, and we're doing that again through dispatch. Okay, we're not going and resetting that value by ourselves. We're sending an action to dispatch in order to unselect the book. Okay, the other thing we can do is click on any of the books that are in the list. Okay, so then we're going to run the select book action to get the action, and the action is sent to dispatch with that book. Okay, so it's going to select that particular book. Okay, then we're going to update the form usage. So this is just a part that has to do with that second form. Okay, so if we were just looking at the book list with no form after it, we wouldn't need this second dispatch. Okay, but the second dispatch is saying when you click on a book, in addition to selecting the book in the list, you're also going to change the usage of the form to view. Okay, and that's what's happening here. So when we click it, it selects the book in the book list. It also sets this form to view, so that we're viewing that particular item. Okay, so those are two different actions that are required in order to get that behavior. Okay, okay, so that's okay. So we have this. That's map dispatch to props. Okay, so we're going to get these things on init, on book click, handle new book click, along with books and app state. We're going to pass all of that data into the book list. Okay, so that one books is going to be used here. App state is going to be used here. On init, it's going to be used at the top. Okay, so here, just to, when you click on an item, it's going to call on book click. When you click on the button, the new button, it's going to click this one here. Okay, and the last thing you need to do, kind of as just as this is sort of, you can think about this as just red tape or paperwork. In order to get the map state to props and the map dispatch to props, to get those values and be able to pass them to the book list, you need to do this connect. Okay. So always at the end of your component, you're going to see a connect, and you're going to pass it to whatever your constant is that you created up here, which is your component. Okay. That's going to create a new component that's going to be passed out as this default here, visible book list. Okay. And this visible book list is the one you're actually going to include in your application. Okay. So I know that's it's a lot for us to go through in a short amount of time, but hopefully you'll be able to go over this and understand what the different steps are. One, just what the concepts are that have to do with Redux, and then what the steps are in order to implement it. Okay. So let's go to here. Okay. So this is where we put up some information about the fact that we are WebAge. We're the ones who put together the webinar, and there's a couple of different courses that are possible. You know, you can go up to the site, get more information about the various courses that we have if you're interested in them. And then just leave it open. We only have a minute or two for questions. Okay, one of the questions was having to do with the source code, and I'm going to talk to the coordinator and see if we can have that sent out. Okay, and see if there's anything else. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to wrap up the webinar now. Thanks to everybody for checking it out. And hopefully, if this is the first time you've been through Redux, you know, we've gone from one end to the other of it, and it does get more, it does get easier to understand the more times you've seen it from beginning to end. So hopefully this gives you what you need. Okay, thanks again for coming, and I'll end us now.